Paul Scheuring told Fox exactly when his show was supposed to end. Before he wrote a single page of the pilot, he had already designed the conclusion. 2 seasons, The Escape, then The Manhunt, then done. Fox looked at 10.5 million viewers on a Monday night in 2005 and decided the story was going to keep going anyway. What followed was 4 more years of television, and a revival 9 years after that. All of it chasing a feeling that had existed completely and perfectly for 1 season inside a prison in Chicago, and was never fully found again. Prison Break did not fall apart because the writers stopped caring or the cast lost interest. The show fell apart because it was built like a clock. Every piece designed for a specific job, every element pointing toward a specific ending. And the network removed the ending and asked the clock to keep running. Today, we are going through exactly how that happened, season by season, decision by decision. Welcome to Between the Episodes. Let's get into it. Section 1. A story with no room to grow. The story of how Prison Break fell apart does not begin with a bad season. It does not begin with a writer's room making poor decisions, or a network executive overriding a creative team, or an actor walking off set. It begins with a decision made before the first episode ever aired. A decision that felt smart at the time, that made complete creative sense, that was arguably the right call, and that quietly set a trap the show would eventually fall into and never come back from. Before the pilot was shot, before the cast was finalized, before a single scene at Fox River State Penitentiary was filmed, the man who created Prison Break sat down with the Fox network and told them exactly how the story was going to work. Paul Scheuring, the creator, had written Prison Break as a miniseries, a closed story, something with a beginning, a middle, and a specific endpoint already decided. He had designed it to cover exactly 2 seasons. The Escape from Fox River would close out Season 1. The manhunt that followed, the brothers running, the authorities closing in from every direction, would fill Season 2. Then, the story would be done. The characters would reach their destination, or not. The screen would go dark. That was the plan. This is not a guess or a reading between the lines of what the show became. Scheuring said it plainly in multiple interviews across multiple years. He said he always had a 2-year plan. He said that before he wrote a single page of the pilot, he needed to know the endgame for every character and every story arc, because he was only comfortable writing stories with a clear ending built into the foundation. When Fox raised the question of how the show could survive beyond a single Prison Break, he told them he could stretch the premise to cover 2 seasons, The Escape and then the life after the escape. But that if the show kept going past that point, they were building without blueprints. He was direct about where the story ended. And then the ratings came in, and everything he said got set to one side. The premiere of Prison Break aired on August 29, 2005. It pulled 10.5 million viewers. For context, Fox had not seen Monday ratings like that since Melrose Place and Ally McBeal were on the air in the late 1990s. The show ranked first in both the 18 to 49 and the 18 to 34 demographic groups on its very first night. Mid-season, Fox ordered 9 additional episodes, making Prison Break the first new series of the 2005 to 2006 television season to be given a full 22-episode order. The numbers were beyond what anyone had predicted. The pressure to keep the show going was enormous. And the problem with that pressure was that it had nowhere good to push the story, because the story had already been built to end. To understand why this was a problem at all, you need to understand what made Season 1 work so well. The premise of Prison Break was almost aggressively simple, and that simplicity was its greatest strength. Michael Scofield, a structural engineer, gets himself sent to Fox River State Penitentiary on purpose. His brother Lincoln is on death row there, convicted of a murder he did not commit. Michael's plan is to break them both out before Lincoln is executed. He has the layout of the prison tattooed across his entire body, hidden inside what looks like decorative artwork. Every episode, the plan moves one step forward, or hits an obstacle that forces a rethink. Every episode, the execution date gets a little closer. Every episode, the clock that was already running gets harder to ignore. That structure worked because it had a deadline locked into it from the start. The execution date was always coming. Every complication mattered because the margin for error was shrinking. The show was built like a very long, very tense countdown. And countdowns only work because they reach zero. The ending was the entire point. The feeling of pressure and momentum that made Season 1 feel like you could not stop watching came directly from the fact that there was a specific moment the story was always moving toward. Season 1 also worked because its location created natural boundaries. Fox River was a contained world. Michael had to move carefully inside it. He had to manage his relationships with guards, with other prisoners, with the warden, with the prison doctor. He could not move too fast or too visibly. The walls of the prison were not just a physical fact. They were the thing that gave every small moment its full weight. A screw coming loose from a bleacher bench. A key left on a counter for 30 seconds too long. A guard going on break at a time that disrupted the plan. Inside Fox River, those things were enormous. They mattered because the stakes were immediate and the walls were real. The tattoo was the show's single cleverest device. Each section of the artwork on Michael's body corresponded to a specific part of the escape plan. A ventilation shaft location, a drainage route, guard rotation schedules, the measurements of a specific wall. The audience and Michael were reading the same map at the same time, working out each element together. And the show revealed pieces of the code at exactly the right pace to keep the puzzle feeling solvable, but not easy. It was a structural trick that no show had done in quite that way before, and it gave Season 1 a feeling of genuine intelligence working underneath the action. Here is the trap buried inside all of that. The tattoo was designed for Fox River, specifically for Fox River. The map encoded on Michael's skin led to one destination and one destination only, out of that one specific prison. Once the escape happened, the tattoo had done its job. The clock that had been driving the plot reached zero. The walls that gave every scene its weight no longer existed. The contained world that made the show feel precise and pressurized was gone. The show had to find something else to be. And finding something else to be, after building an audience on a very specific kind of story, is one of the most difficult things a television show can do. Season 2 made a genuine attempt. Schering described it publicly as The Fugitive ×8. The escaped prisoners scattering to different parts of the country, the authorities closing in, each character pursuing separate goals. It worked well enough. Critics gave it a 71% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The show kept its energy. But even in Season 2, the Rotten Tomatoes critics' consensus noted something that matters. The show had branched out into a series of separate storylines that might lose some viewers. The single focused pressure of Season 1, one man, one prison, one plan, one clock, had been replaced by 8 different people going in 8 different directions. The precision that made Season 1 feel like a machine running at full speed had already started to loosen. Then Season 2 ended with Michael being placed in a Panamanian jail. Schering later described this in his own words as a screeching right turn. The show heading toward its designed conclusion, everything wrapping toward the ending he had planned, and then suddenly swerving sideways into a 3rd season that had never been part of the blueprint. He described it with a kind of exhausted humor. He made the sound of tires skidding. The show had been built to land at a specific destination, and a commercial decision redirected it mid-flight. Season 3 landed at 50% on Rotten Tomatoes. The critics' consensus called it a season that felt like it was retreading old ground with a series of new tricks, covering for the fact that the original story was gone. Season 4 also sat at 50%, with critics describing its twists as ludicrous and plot-breaking, and specifically noting that the show felt like something that should have been put to rest 1 or 2 seasons earlier. These were not isolated negative reviews from a few critics who disliked the show. These were the aggregate scores from all available critical opinion, landing in the same place for 2 consecutive seasons. The audience figures moved in the same direction. Season 1 averaged 9.2 million viewers per week. By Season 4, that number had fallen to 6.1 million. Over the course of 4 seasons, the show lost more than 3 million regular viewers, roughly a third of the audience that had been there from the start. People did not turn off Prison Break because something catastrophic happened to it. They drifted away slowly, season by season, as the show kept trying to replicate something that could not be replicated, because it had been designed as a one-time structure. On January 13, 2009, Fox president Kevin Reilly stood in front of reporters at the TV Critics Press Tour and confirmed the show was ending with Season 4. He said that Prison Break had reached a point where a lot of the stories had been told. He said the team wanted to end strong. The language was careful and measured. What it described was a show that had exhausted the story it was built around and had been running on improvised fuel for 2 seasons. Schering was more direct in later interviews. He said he was burned out after 2 seasons. He said that when Fox eventually brought him back to work on the 2017 revival, his condition was that it be a limited run, 9 episodes, and not a full 22-episode season order. He said specifically that one of the biggest problems with network television at that time was the requirement for 22 episodes per season. A story designed to close within a set amount of time had been forced to keep generating new material past the point where the premise could naturally support it. The writers who worked on Seasons 3 and 4 were not the problem. The problem was structural. They were being asked to build new floors on a foundation that had only ever been designed to hold one story. You can keep stacking, and people can be very skilled at the stacking. But at some point, the original structure starts to show through what has been added on top of it. The cracks become visible. The seams where the new parts connect to the old ones stop being hidden. Prison Break's foundation was this: one man, one prison, one plan, one execution date, one exit. Everything that followed, the fugitive season, the Panamanian jail, the spy mission, the data heist, was an attempt to rebuild that same tension without the same structure. And each season made the original feeling a little more distant, a little harder to reach, a little more like a memory of what the show once was, rather than what the show currently was. By season 4, the show had become something that bore almost no resemblance to what season 1 had been. The tight, clock-driven precision of Fox River had been replaced by a story about retrieving 6 pieces of a data device from 6 different people across Los Angeles. The critics said the show should have ended earlier. What they were actually describing was a show that had been living past its designed lifespan for 2 full seasons, and that the effort of sustaining itself had steadily cost it the qualities that made it worth sustaining. The structural problem was the first thing that needed to go wrong, and it went wrong before season 2 even began. The moment Fox saw those 10.5 million viewers and decided the story was going to keep going. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the structure of the show was only one layer of what broke. Underneath the structural problems were human ones. And the first real crack in Prison Break's human story did not happen in a meeting or a planning session. It happened in a contract negotiation that ended with a major character appearing to die off-screen. Her presence in the story reduced to an image so jarring that audiences had not fully processed it before the show was already trying to walk it back. Section 2. The deal that broke the story. Sarah Tancredi was not supposed to die. That sentence contains everything. All the context that matters about what went wrong with the show during its 3rd season. All the behind-the-scenes chaos that audiences only partly understood at the time. All the damage done to the story by a situation that had nothing to do with writing or creativity or any kind of artistic decision. Sarah Tancredi was not supposed to die. She died because a business agreement fell apart. And the way she died, and then the way that death was undone less than a year later, left a mark on the show that never fully faded. To understand what happened, it helps to understand what Sarah was inside the story of Prison Break. She was the prison doctor at Fox River State Penitentiary. She was also the daughter of the state governor, the man whose office was directly connected to the conspiracy that had put Lincoln on death row in the first place. She met Michael during his regular visits to the infirmary. Those visits were part of the plan. Michael needed access to certain parts of the prison that a regular inmate could not reach, and the infirmary was one of them. What was not part of the plan was that Sarah figured out what he was doing and helped him anyway, because she had looked at the case against Lincoln and decided something was deeply wrong with it. That decision cost her everything she had. By the end of season 1, Sarah had lost her job, her relationship with her father, and her freedom. By the end of season 2, she and Michael were genuinely in love. She was on the run alongside him, and the show had built a romantic story that a huge portion of its audience cared about deeply. The character had gone from a supporting figure to one of the emotional pillars the whole series rested on. Audiences were not just watching the escape story. They were watching Michael and Sarah find each other inside an impossible situation. That relationship was load-bearing. It held up a lot of the emotional weight that made the show feel like more than an action series. Sarah Wayne Callies, the actress who played Sarah, found out she was pregnant in early 2007. Her publicist announced it on January 23rd of that year. At the time, Callies was living in a remote area of Canada and had been planning to settle there. Season 3 of Prison Break was scheduled to begin production that year, and the producers wanted her back for the full run of episodes. What followed was a negotiation that went on for a significant period and eventually collapsed entirely. The executive producer of the show at the time was Matt Olmstead. He later described the entire situation in detail during interviews with TV Guide. Interviews that are the primary source for almost everything that is known about this period. According to Olmstead, the production team started by asking Callies to appear in the first 13 episodes of Season 3. The idea was to give her character a proper ending, a goodbye that would give Michael and Sarah's story some emotional closure before she was written out. Callies declined that offer. The team came back with 11 episodes. That was declined too. Then 10 episodes. Declined. Then 9. Declined. Then 4 episodes. A fraction of the season. Just enough to give the character a dignified exit. Also declined. At some point, the team suggested flying a camera crew out to her location in Canada so she would not have to travel at all during her pregnancy. That offer was also turned down. The negotiation eventually reached the point where the team asked whether she would record a phone conversation. Not even appear on screen, just provide her voice. That too was turned down. Callies released a statement through her spokesperson to TV Guide in fall 2007. The statement said that despite everyone's best efforts, she and the Prison Break team had been unable to find a way that worked for both the story and her family. She said she parted from the show wishing everyone well. She said she was grateful for the fans and hoped they would keep watching. The statement was gracious and said almost nothing about what had actually happened. Olmstead was more direct in his own comments. He said there were no hard feelings, that the show was an ensemble and would move forward, and that the decision to kill Sarah off had been the only remaining option once every other path had been closed off. The death itself was extraordinary in how it was handled. Sarah Tancredi did not die on screen. There was no scene, no confrontation, no final moment between her and Michael. The audience was told Sarah was dead through what appeared to be a severed head inside a box. Lincoln received the box. He looked inside it. He understood what it meant. The camera did not show the contents at length. It showed enough. The implication was clear, and it was brutal. And it came out of nowhere because the show had not built toward it at all. Because the show had not been able to build toward it. Callies had not agreed to film any part of it. The whole thing was constructed around her absence. The audience reacted badly. That is an understatement. The response to Sarah's death was one of the most negative reactions the show had received since it began. Viewers were upset about the character. They were upset about the manner of the death, off-screen, with no farewell, with no closure for one of the show's most important relationships. Some were upset because they had heard about the contract dispute and felt the way the character had been handled was unfair, both to the audience and to the actress. The online conversation around the show in late 2007 was dominated by Sarah's death in a way the producers had not fully anticipated. Olmstead, in the same set of TV Guide interviews, acknowledged something very specific about how the death had been filmed. He said that when the team wrote and shot the scene, they realized almost immediately that they had left a gap in it. Lincoln had glanced at the head in the box for a very short moment. Nobody had explicitly confirmed whose head it was. Nobody had seen the death happen. The show had, possibly by accident and possibly by instinct, not fully committed to the death. And once Olmsted recognized that gap existed, the team quietly filed it away and kept it in their back pocket. Because the response to Sarah's absence was so severe, the producers went back to Callus while Season 3 was still airing. Olmsted said that once the team started discussing what the emotional foundation of Season 4 was going to be, what would keep Michael going, what would give the story its center, they kept arriving at the same answer. Sarah. She needed to come back. The death that had been constructed out of necessity was reversed on the same grounds. Necessity. Callus agreed to return. The deal was made. The head in the box was retroactively explained as a fake, a prop used by one of the antagonists to manipulate the brothers into compliance. Sarah had actually escaped and was in hiding. Olmsted's explanation for this reversal was direct. He said the fans who were still asking whether Sarah was really dead were not actually asking a question. They were expressing a hope. And when enough people are expressing the same hope loudly enough, a television production takes notice. The reversal solved one problem and created another. Bringing Sarah back gave Season 4 its emotional core and allowed the show to honor the relationship that audiences had invested in. Callus returned for the full run of Season 4 and remained with the show through the 2017 revival. On that level, the correction worked. But the sequence of events, the death, the outcry, the reversal, had done something to the show's credibility that could not be undone by simply explaining it away. The audience had watched a character die in Season 3. They had processed that death. Some had accepted it and decided to keep watching. Some had stopped watching because of it. And then Season 4 arrived and told them that the death had not been real, that the head in the box had been a trick, that the moment of apparent loss they had experienced as viewers had been based on something that the show was now walking back. For the people who had stayed, the reversal was a relief. For the show's relationship with its own narrative consequences, it was a problem. Prison Break had always required a specific kind of trust from its audience. The show asked people to believe that the plan was real, that the stakes were real, that the things that happened to the characters had genuine weight. The tattoo encoded a real map. The execution date was a real clock. The threats to the people Michael cared about were real threats. That was the contract with the audience. Everything in the show had to feel like it had actual consequences. Because the moment it stopped feeling that way, the tension that made the show work would disappear. When Sarah came back in Season 4, the message, however unintentional, was that death inside Prison Break was not necessarily permanent. That a major character could be killed, that audiences could grieve the loss, and that the decision could then be reversed if the response was strong enough. The Sarah situation did not destroy that trust on its own, but combined with everything else that was happening to the show. Structurally, at the same time, it weakened the foundation a little further. The audience started watching with a slightly different understanding of how the show operated. They knew now that consequences could be walked back. They knew the production would respond to pressure. They knew the story was more flexible than Season 1 had made it appear. Callus, for her part, has spoken generously about her time on the show across the years that followed. She and her former co-star, Paul Adelstein, who played Agent Paul Kellerman, launched a rewatch podcast called Prison Breaking in January 2024, revisiting every episode and discussing the production openly. The existence of that podcast suggests that the relationships between the cast members and the show remained genuine, and that whatever happened during the contract situation in 2007 was not something that permanently damaged those connections. But the damage to the show was a separate thing from the damage to the relationships. The show had lost one of its central characters for an entire season due to a negotiation that failed. The replacement for that character's absence, a death so blunt and unearned that it alienated a significant portion of the audience, had then been reversed within one cycle of the show. And the reversal, as welcome as it was to many viewers, had demonstrated something about how Prison Break operated that Season 1 had never revealed. The story of what happened to Sarah Tancredi is really the story of what happens when the pressures around a television show, scheduling, contracts, network timelines, pregnancy, geography, start making creative decisions that the writers and producers then have to work around. Those pressures are real. They exist on every production. Most of the time, they get resolved without the audience ever knowing they happened. This time, the resolution ended up on screen in the most visible way possible, and the show wore the consequences across the rest of its run. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything that would come next was already in motion before Season 3 even aired. While the production team was negotiating with Callis and trying to figure out how to handle her absence, a completely separate crisis was developing outside the industry entirely. A labor dispute had been building for months, and by the time Season 3 was underway, it was about to hit the television industry with enough force to cut the season nearly in half and permanently alter what the show was able to do. Section 3. The strike that snapped the season in half. In the autumn of 2007, while the Prison Break production team was still trying to manage the fallout from the Sarah Tancredi situation, the television industry walked off the job. The Writers Guild of America went on strike on November 5, 2007. The dispute was between the writers who created the scripts for films and television shows and the major studios and networks that produced them. The core issue was money, specifically how much writers should be paid when their work was distributed through newer channels like the internet and DVD releases. The studios and the writers had been negotiating for months without reaching an agreement. And when those negotiations broke down completely, the writers stopped working. Picket lines went up outside studios across Los Angeles. Television productions that were already shooting had to halt. Shows that had not yet started production were delayed. The entire industry shifted into a kind of suspended state, waiting for the two sides to reach a deal. The strike lasted 100 days. By any measure, that is a long time for a television industry to be operating without its writing staff. The immediate effect on audiences was visible within weeks. Reality television flooded the schedules because those formats did not require the kind of writing covered by the Guild agreement. Scripted dramas and comedies either aired whatever episodes had already been completed before the strike began, or went dark entirely. Some shows were lucky enough to have stockpiled enough finished episodes to ride out the full 100 days without interruption. Most were not that lucky. Prison Break was not that lucky. Season 3 had begun airing on September 17, 2007, roughly 6 weeks before the strike started. The season had been planned as a full run, either 22 or 23 episodes, matching the length of the previous 2 seasons. The writers had a clear idea of where the season was going. The central story of Season 3 placed Michael inside a Panamanian prison called Penitenciaria Federal de Zona, a facility that the show established as far more dangerous and far less structured than Fox River had been. Sona was presented as a place where the guards had essentially surrendered control of the interior to the prisoners themselves. There were no rules inside. Violence was constant. Getting out would require a completely different kind of thinking than the meticulous architectural planning that had defined Michael's approach at Fox River. The plan for the season, as it had been structured before the strike hit, called for the escape from Sona to happen somewhere in the middle of the season. The breakout was going to be the mid-season climax, the moment that reset the energy of the story and launched the second half of the season in a new direction. Everything in the first half of the season was being built toward that moment. Once it happened, the back half of the season would deal with what came after. The escape from Sona was the engine of the whole thing, and the writers had deliberately positioned it in the middle of the season because they had another 13 or so episodes of story to tell on the other side of it. The strike arrived, and that plan became impossible. When the work stoppage began, Prison Break had 11 episodes completed and in various stages of being aired. The production could not continue. No new scripts could be written. The season that had been designed to run to 22 or 23 episodes was going to end at 13. The mid-season climax, the escape from Sona, was no longer going to be a mid-season event. The writers had to quickly rework what they had so that episode 13 could function as a finale, because episode 13 was going to be the last episode audiences saw for a very long time. The official Prison Break on Fox social media account later confirmed this directly. The escape from Sona had originally been planned as the mid-season cliffhanger. Due to the strike, the mid-season cliffhanger had to become the season finale. The moment that was supposed to launch the second half of a 22-episode run was repurposed as the closing image of a 13-episode run. The season ended where it had been designed to pause. The difference between a mid-season cliffhanger and a season finale is enormous. A mid-season cliffhanger does not need to provide closure. Its entire job is to leave things unresolved in a way that creates excitement for what comes next. A season finale carries different expectations. Audiences expect some degree of arrival, a sense that the story has reached a resting point, even if major questions remain open. When the escape from Sona was repositioned as the finale, it landed somewhere between those two things, carrying the energy of a cliffhanger but the weight of a finale, and satisfying the full demands of neither. The numbers confirm what the situation was. Season 1 had 22 episodes. Season 2 had 22 episodes. Season 3 had 13. 9 episodes of story that had been planned, outlined, and in some cases partially written, simply did not exist on screen. Whatever the writers had been building toward in the back half of Season 3, whatever character developments, whatever plot resolutions, whatever escalations had been scheduled for episodes 14 through 22, none of it ever reached the audience. The season that aired was less than 60% of the season that had been designed. The production cost for Season 3 was documented at approximately $3 million per episode, and the filming was done in Dallas, Texas. Those are the concrete production facts of a season that was already dealing with the Sarah Tancredi situation on top of the strike. The show was spending significant money per episode on a season it could not finish. The critical response to Season 3 was split in an interesting way. IGN, reviewing the completed 13-episode run, gave it an 8.5 out of 10. The reviewer wrote that with so much going against it, the shortened season could have been a disaster, but that the writers had managed to salvage it and tell a tightly built, action-driven story. That is a genuine piece of praise, and it points to something true about Season 3. that the writers on the show were skilled, that they did the best possible job with a situation that had been drastically narrowed by external circumstances, and that the season they delivered under those conditions was more coherent than it had any right to be. But the Rotten Tomatoes aggregate told a different story. Season 3 landed at 50% from critics as a whole, with the consensus describing it as a season that felt like it was retreading old ground and covering for a lack of original story with a series of new tricks. That reading is harder to dismiss than IGN's individual enthusiasm, because it represents the broader critical picture rather than one strong review. The consensus language, retreading old ground, new contrivances, describes a season that felt like it was spinning its wheels, and the circumstances of the strike go a long way toward explaining why. The strike also killed something else connected to Prison Break that most people have forgotten about entirely. In October 2007, The Hollywood Reporter published a story about a planned spin-off series from the Prison Break team. The show was going to be called Prison Break Cherry Hill. It would have followed a woman named Molly, an upper-middle-class housewife who finds herself serving time in a women's prison. The original plan was to introduce the character of Molly during Season 3 of Prison Break itself, then spin her out into her own separate series that would operate independently while sharing the Prison Break brand. The model being discussed was similar to how CSI had generated CSI Miami and CSI NY. The same world, different locations, different casts. The writers' strike made the introduction of Molly in Season 3 impossible, since there was no longer a full season available to develop a new character in. Once the introduction was off the table, the spin-off lost its entry point. Fox eventually abandoned the project entirely. Prison Break Cherry Hill never went into production. The planned expansion of the Prison Break world into a second series died as a direct result of the 9 episodes that never got made. This matters to the larger story of the show because it demonstrates that at the time of Season 3, the people running Prison Break and the people at Fox genuinely believed the franchise had the life in it to sustain a second series. That belief was not unreasonable, given the ratings the show had been pulling. But the strike damaged the foundation of Season 3 severely enough that whatever momentum might have carried a spin-off into existence was significantly reduced. The audience that Season 4 would need to launch something new had already started to shrink. There is a version of Season 3 that does not exist anywhere. A full 22-episode run where the escape from Sona is a mid-season event rather than a finale, where the back half of the season explores what comes after that escape, where character arcs get the space to develop fully, and where the story arrives at its endpoint without the compression that 13 episodes forced on it. That version of Season 3 might have changed everything about how the show's final years played out. It might have given Season 4 a more solid foundation to build on. It might have changed how audiences felt about the show going into what turned out to be its final original run. That version does not exist. The strike removed it from possibility, and the show had to continue from a position that was already weaker than the one it had been aiming for. What is worth sitting with is how many problems were already stacked against Season 3 before a single episode had aired. The show had been designed as a 2-season story and was now producing its third. The central actress in one of the show's most important relationships had been unable to reach a contract agreement and had been written out in the most jarring way possible. And the season itself had been cut by 9 episodes, forcing a mid-story climax to become a finale. Any one of those 3 things would have been a significant challenge. All 3 arrived at the same time. Season 3 survived that combination more effectively than it probably should have, and the IGN review reflecting that is fair. But surviving is different from thriving. The show got through Season 3. The damage that Season 3 represented, structural, narrative, creative, carried forward into Season 4. And Season 4 did not have the same ability to absorb it. The season that followed tried to solve every problem at once. Sarah came back. The show moved to a new city. The genre shifted from a prison story into something closer to a spy mission. A new MacGuffin replaced the tattoo as the central object everyone was chasing. And the audience, which had already been watching the show slowly change shape across 3 seasons, was now being asked to follow it somewhere it had never said it was going. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Season 4 is where the show stopped being a version of itself and became something else entirely. And understanding how that happened requires looking at what Season 4 actually was. Because what the writers built, and what Fox put on screen, and what the audience eventually stopped showing up for, were 3 different things wearing the same name. Section 4. The show that forgot what it was. Season 4 of Prison Break begins with a Homeland Security agent named Don Self approaching Michael, Lincoln, and the rest of the group and offering them a deal. He will get all of them off the hook. No more fugitive status, no more running. Full pardons for every crime connected to everything that has happened since Fox River, if they agree to work for him on a covert mission. The mission is to locate and steal a device called Scylla from a powerful shadow organization known as the Company. Scylla contains crucial data that, once in government hands, will allow the Company to be dismantled entirely. The group agrees. They set up a base of operations in Los Angeles, and Prison Break, a show that had been built entirely around the specific, confined, pressure cooker world of a maximum security prison, became a spy team procedural operating out of a rented house in California. That shift was not subtle. It was not a gradual evolution or a natural extension of what the show had been doing. Season 4 arrived as a different genre, wearing the same cast of characters. The prison was gone. The walls were gone. The deadline was gone. The tattoo, the device that had given Season 1 its unique identity, the encoded map that audiences had spent a full season helping Michael read, was gone too, in the most literal sense possible. Michael had the tattoo removed between seasons. The burns from the removal process were shown on screen. The single most distinctive visual element of the entire series was written out of the show's body in the first minutes of its final original season. What replaced the tattoo was Scylla. Understanding what Scylla was and how the season was built around it is essential to understanding why Season 4 landed so differently from everything that came before it. Scylla was not a single object. The data it contained was divided across 6 separate cards, each card held by a different person, all 6 of whom were connected to the Company in different ways. To get Scylla, the team had to locate each card holder, find a way to get close to them, and copy the data from their card using a scanning device. 6 card holders meant 6 separate operations across the season. 6 separate penetrations of 6 separate locations, each requiring a different approach and a different plan. The structure this created was essentially a series of smaller heists, strung together across 22 episodes. Each operation had its own setup, its own obstacles, and its own resolution. The team would identify the next card holder, plan how to get the card, execute the plan with some complication arising midway, and then move on to the next one. This is a recognizable format. It has worked on many television shows and films. The problem was not that it was a bad format in general. The problem was that it had almost nothing in common with the format that had built Prison Break's audience. Season 1 worked because it had one location, one plan, one clock, and a team of characters whose entire function was defined by that specific situation. Every scene existed in relation to the escape. Every conversation, every obstacle, every small victory and setback was part of a single, interconnected machine moving toward one outcome. The story had the feeling of something that could only go one way, and the tension came from watching whether it would get there. The audience was not watching multiple storylines running in parallel. They were watching one thing happen in real time, and that one thing had a specific end, point they were being carried toward, whether they liked it or not. Season 4 had 6 operations, a rotating cast of antagonists, and a team doing tasks that were not organically connected to each other. The connection between operations was sequential, one after another, rather than structural. Nothing about retrieving the 3rd card made the retrieval of the 4th card feel more urgent. The season did not build in the way Season 1 had built. It accumulated. And accumulation is a very different feeling from momentum. The critics registered this. The Rotten Tomatoes score for Season 4 was 50%, landing in the same place as Season 3, and confirming that 2 consecutive seasons of the show had now been rated as more negative than positive by the critical consensus. The language the critics used in their consensus statement was direct. They said the season's twists were ludicrous and plot-breaking. They said the show felt like something that should have ended 1 or 2 prison breaks earlier. These are not vague complaints about quality. They are specific observations about a show that had outrun its own story and was now generating plot in order to fill a season-length container, rather than in service of a story that needed to be told. The audience numbers confirmed the same thing from a different angle. Season 4 averaged 6.1 million viewers per week. Season 1 had averaged 9.2 million. The show had lost more than 3 million regular viewers across its run. Some of those viewers had left after Season 2, when the focused pressure of Fox River gave way to a manhunt across multiple locations. Some had left during Season 3, when the combination of Sarah's death and the strike-shortened run had disrupted their connection to the story. By the time Season 4 arrived as a spy procedural in Los Angeles, the audience that remained was a fraction of the one that had been there at the start. The villain situation in Season 4 illustrates the problem with particular clarity. The season opened with a character called Wyatt as one of its primary threats. Wyatt worked for the company as an enforcer, and he was genuinely frightening, controlled, precise, and capable of real violence. His storyline involved the death of Alex Mahone's son, and the arc that followed, in which Mahone hunted Wyatt down across several episodes, was widely identified by reviewers as one of the most emotionally effective things the season did. It worked because it was personal. Mahone had a specific reason to be in motion, and that reason had genuine emotional weight behind it. Wyatt's arc ended in the 9th episode. The character who was supposed to be the season's central threat, the figure the story had positioned as the primary danger to the team, was gone before the season was halfway through. What followed was a rotating series of authority figures representing the company, the most prominent being a character known as the General, who served as the organization's leader and the season's supposed main antagonist. Reviewers described the general as more annoying than frightening, and noted that the audience never received a clear explanation of what the company's actual goals were, or why Scylla was so important to them, beyond a vague suggestion that it contained world-changing technological information. Then, in the back half of the season, the lead villain changed again. The general was displaced by a new antagonist, Michael and Lincoln's mother, Christina Schofield, who had been established as dead. She was not dead. She had been operating within the company for years, and her goals turned out to conflict with the general's, which led to the two of them working against each other while the team tried to maneuver around both. The season's threat landscape had gone from a focused, personal danger in Wyatt to a vague organizational menace in the general to a family revelation in Christina, and the transitions between those phases felt less like a story escalating and more like a show replacing its problems rather than resolving them. Reviewers at the time noted that by the point Christina Schofield became the season's central antagonist, the suspension of disbelief that had carried audiences through the earlier seasons was no longer holding. The show had asked for a lot of trust over 4 years. Season 4 was asking for more of it than the previous 3 seasons had prepared the audience to give. A mother who had been dead was now alive and powerful, and connected to every part of the conspiracy that had been present since the beginning. The revelation did not recontextualize the earlier seasons in a way that felt earned. It arrived as a plot mechanism, and it landed that way. Scylla itself, once the team actually obtained it, changed meaning multiple times across the season. It was described initially as the company's Black Book, a record of everything the organization had done and everyone it had connections to. The kind of document that would destroy the organization if made public. As the season continued, Scylla was revealed to contain something different. The device held information and blueprints for advanced technology, solar energy solutions, medical breakthroughs, inventions with genuinely significant real-world value. The company was not protecting secret criminal records. It was protecting a set of innovations it intended to control for profit. This revision of what Scylla actually was did not make the stakes feel higher. If anything, it made the earlier episodes feel less coherent in retrospect, because the audience had understood the urgency of obtaining Scylla based on one premise, and then discovered mid-season that the premise had been different all along. One reviewer made the observation that the simplest and most logical thing the team could have done upon obtaining Scylla was to post its contents to every major newspaper and news organization simultaneously, making whatever it contained public, and therefore removing the company's ability to control it. The season did not take that route, and the reasons it offered for not doing so were not entirely satisfying. Paul Scheuring, the show's creator, had stepped back from running the day-to-day production by this point. He remained an executive producer on Season 4, but the hands-on creative control that had defined his work on Season 1 and Season 2 had been reduced. The writers working on Season 4 were capable and experienced television professionals, but they were working on a show that was structurally very different from the one Scheuring had designed, without the guiding framework of a closed-ended story to give the season its shape. What they produced was, by the standard of most television, a reasonable piece of entertainment. By the standard of what Prison Break had been at its best, it was a significant step down, and the critics and the audience both registered that step. Sarah Tancredi was back, which gave Michael and the story its emotional center again. Her return was handled carefully, with the first episode of the season addressing where she had been during the period of her supposed death, and Callis committed fully to the material she was given. The relationship between Michael and Sarah, once restored to the screen, did carry real feeling. But even that restoration carried a reminder of the season before. The narrative gymnastics required to explain away her death were visible in the explanation. And the explanation asked the audience to accept that a moment of apparent loss they had experienced had been based on something false. On January 13, 2009, while Season 4 was still airing, Fox president Kevin Reilly stood in front of reporters at the TV Critics Press Tour and confirmed that the show would end when the season concluded. He said that Prison Break had reached a point where the stories had been told. He said the team wanted to end strong. The show was given 6 final episodes to wrap everything up after a mid-season break, and 2 additional episodes that were shot but not aired on television. Instead, released later as a standalone film called Prison Break: The Final Break on DVD and Blu-ray on July 21, 2009. The series ended. Michael Scofield died. The story that Paul Scheuring had designed to close within 2 seasons finally reached its conclusion in 4. And the conclusion carried the weight of a show that had been running past its natural endpoint for longer than it had been running within it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. But the story of Prison Break did not end in 2009. 9 years later, the show came back. The same creator, most of the same cast, a new premise designed to explain how Michael Scofield, who had died on screen, could be alive again. And the question of whether that return worked, whether it captured anything of what had made Season 1 feel the way it did, is a question with a clear answer. And the answer is not the one Fox was hoping for when they put the revival on the schedule. Section 5. The return that proved the point. 9 years is a long time to be away. When Prison Break ended in 2009, the television landscape was already changing in ways that nobody had fully mapped yet. Streaming services were beginning to grow. The idea that a canceled show could find a second life through people discovering it on a platform years after it had left the air was becoming real rather than theoretical. And Prison Break, as it turned out, was one of the early shows to demonstrate exactly how that could work. When Netflix added Prison Break to its library in the years following the original run, new audiences found the show in significant numbers. People who had been too young to watch it during its original broadcast discovered Season 1 and experienced the same pull that had driven those 10.5 million viewers to Fox on Monday nights in 2005. The show had not aged in the way that some feared it might. The premise was still clean. The execution of Season 1 was still tightly built. The feeling of watching a plan come together under pressure was still effective. The show found a second wave of audience enthusiasm through streaming, and that enthusiasm eventually caught the attention of Fox. In August 2015, Fox announced that a 5th season of Prison Break was being discussed. In January 2016, the network confirmed the season had been officially approved and would move forward. The revival would bring back Wentworth Miller as Michael Scofield and Dominic Purcell as Lincoln Burrows, along with most of the surviving members of the original cast. The season was originally planned to span 10 episodes before being shortened to 9. It premiered on April 4, 2017, and ran until May 30th of that year. The central creative problem the revival had to solve before anything else was the fact that Michael Scofield was dead. Michael had died at the end of Season 4. His death had been the show's closing emotional statement. The man who had sacrificed everything to save his brother, ultimately giving his life in the process of securing the freedom of the people he loved. It was the kind of ending that felt final, precisely because the cost of it was so high. The audience had watched Michael operate at the center of every season for 4 years. They had followed him through Fox River, through the Manhunt, through Sona, through the Scylla mission, through the restoration of his relationship with Sarah. His death was the show acknowledging that a story like his could not end anywhere else. Bringing him back required an explanation. Paul Scheuring, who returned as showrunner for the revival, was direct about this in interviews ahead of the season. He said the show would not move forward without Wentworth Miller, and since Michael had apparently died, the mystery of how he could still be alive would be central to Season 5. He described making Michael's return a puzzle rather than simply announcing it as a fact. The season opened with Lincoln receiving word that Michael was alive and imprisoned in a facility in Yemen in the Middle East. And the season's story was built around Lincoln and a small group traveling to Yemen to break him out. Scheuring also said something in those pre-season interviews that reflected everything he had said about the show's original design years earlier. He said the revival was only possible because the format of television had changed. A limited run, 9 episodes with a defined ending, was something he could work with. A full 22-episode season order would have been something he would have walked away from. The closed-ended story that he had always preferred was now something the industry could accommodate in a way it had not been able to when Prison Break was at its peak. The revival was, in a sense, an attempt to go back to what the show should have been from the beginning. A contained story with a specific endpoint built into it before filming started. The numbers that Season 5 produced told a clear story. The revival averaged 3.96 million viewers across its 9-episode run, according to figures reported at the time of the season's conclusion. To put that in context, Season 1 had averaged 9.2 million. Season 4, the season that Fox had canceled due to falling ratings, had averaged 6.1 million. The revival drew less than half the audience that Season 1 had, and significantly less than the season that had been canceled 9 years earlier. Fox had hoped that the combination of Netflix-driven renewed interest and the return of the original cast would bring audiences back to the show in large numbers. The numbers that came in suggested the opposite, that the audience the show had built was not waiting in large enough numbers to make the revival a genuine ratings success. The critical response was similarly measured. Season 5 landed at 56% on Rotten Tomatoes, which placed it slightly above the 50% scores of Seasons 3 and 4, but well below the 79% and 71% of the first 2 seasons. The critics' consensus described the revival as recapturing some of the show's original urgency, but falling short because the plot simultaneously managed to be boring and unbelievable. On Metacritic, Season 5 scored 48 out of 100, a figure that placed it in the mixed to average range from the 18 critics who reviewed it. The Rotten Tomatoes language is worth examining carefully. A show being described as boring and unbelievable at the same time is a specific kind of failure. Boring suggests the story was not generating enough tension or forward momentum. Unbelievable suggests the plot was asking for more trust from the audience than it had earned. Both of those problems trace back to the same root: the difficulty of rebuilding, from scratch, the particular combination of elements that had made Season 1 feel the way it did. Season 5 was set in Yemen and drew on the real-world instability of the region. Scheuring said in interviews before the season aired that he had chosen Yemen specifically because he wanted the most hostile possible environment for a group of Americans trying to engineer an escape. The location was unfamiliar to most of the audience, which was part of the point. The danger should feel real and immediate in a place that has no connection to the comfortable world of the original show's American setting. The premise had the right instincts behind it. The execution had some of the same problems that seasons 3 and 4 had encountered, and for a version of the same reason. The specific tension of season 1 came from a very particular set of conditions. Michael knowing exactly where he was, having studied the building he was trying to escape down to its architectural details, encoding that knowledge in a map he carried on his own body, and then having to execute a plan that accounted for every variable while operating under constant observation. The Yemen setting offered none of those conditions. Michael was reacting to an unfamiliar environment rather than mastering a familiar one. The show that had been defined by meticulous preparation was now largely improvising, and the difference was felt by audiences and critics alike. The cast returned with genuine commitment to the material. Wentworth Miller's performance as Michael had always been one of the show's most consistent strengths, and his presence in season 5 gave the revival its emotional continuity. The characters who came back, Sucre, Teabag, C-Note, Sarah, each had storylines that attempted to account for the 9 years that had passed since the original run. Schuring had been deliberate about this, saying in his Collider interview before the season that he wanted to explore what had happened to each of these people in the intervening time, and that the emotional complexity of those changes was what would make the revival feel meaningful rather than merely mechanical. Teabag's storyline in season 5 is worth noting as a specific example of something the revival did with genuine care. Robert Knepper's character had always occupied a strange space in the show. A violent and genuinely dangerous man who was also, in his own particular way, one of the show's most watchable characters. Season 5 gave Teabag a family connection he had never had before. A son named Whip, who became part of the group assembled to break Michael out. The storyline gave Knepper material that was different from anything Teabag had been given in the original run. And the arc, in which Teabag finds something to care about and then loses it, had the kind of emotional specificity that the best moments of the original show had produced. Schuring himself later acknowledged the loss with characteristic bluntness, describing himself as a heartless writer for what the season did to Teabag's story. But individual moments of quality inside season 5 could not resolve the larger problem the revival was facing, which was not a problem of craft so much as a problem of position. The show was returning from a 9-year absence to an audience that had changed, a television landscape that had changed, and a story that had already been concluded. Michael's death had been a genuine ending. Reversing it, even with the careful mystery the season built around the reversal, required the audience to accept that the ending they had already processed had been something other than what it appeared to be. The Sarah situation in Season 3 had established a precedent for this kind of reversal. Season 5 applied the same logic to the show's central character. In January 2018, Fox confirmed that a 6th season of Prison Break was in early development. The revival had not been the ratings success the network had hoped for, but the conversation about continuing was real for a period. Then, in August 2019, Fox announced there were no current plans to revive Prison Break any further. The 6th season that had been discussed never moved into actual production. The final piece that closed the door on any future seasons came from Wentworth Miller himself. In late 2020, Miller stated publicly that he would not be returning to play straight characters going forward. He had come out as gay in 2013, and his decision not to continue playing heterosexual roles was personal and considered. Without Miller, there was no Michael Scofield. Without Michael Scofield, there was no Prison Break. The show that Fox had canceled in 2009, revived in 2017, and briefly considered continuing in 2018, was finished. The arc of the revival is its own kind of confirmation of everything that the original run's later seasons had demonstrated. The thing that made Prison Break work could not be reconstructed simply by reassembling the pieces. Schering knew this going in. He had said as much in multiple interviews, describing the pressure he felt to match the quality of Season 1 as an enormous bar to clear. He had required a story that was genuinely strong enough to justify bringing the show back, and he had returned only because he felt he had found one. Whether Season 5 cleared that bar is something the numbers and the critical scores settled conclusively. The revival drew 3.96 million viewers on average. Season 1 had drawn 9.2 million. The difference between those two numbers is the distance between what Prison Break was when it was working perfectly and what it became when it was being sustained by will and affection rather than by the structural engine that had driven it in the first place. There is something worth sitting with in the way the show's story ends. A series that began with a brilliantly simple premise: one man, one prison, one plan, eventually ran out of ways to replicate that simplicity, and spent its later years trying on different frameworks until the audience that had come for the original thing had largely moved on. The revival confirmed that the audience could not simply be called back by the return of familiar faces. The faces were familiar. The feeling was not. What the numbers and the scores and the cancellations all point toward is a single question about Prison Break that the show itself answered across its run without ever directly addressing it. The question is whether the show was a great series or a great first season. Those are different things. And the answer, looking at the full record of what the show became across 5 seasons and 12 years, suggests that Prison Break was one of the greatest first seasons in the history of network television, built on top of a premise that the television industry's commercial structure was never going to allow to end on its own terms. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The full picture of why the show fell apart is made of all these parts together: the 2-season design, the contract breakdown, the strike, the identity crisis of Season 4, the revival that couldn't recapture the original. But underneath all of those specific events is a simpler and more permanent truth about what Prison Break actually was, and why no amount of new seasons or new locations or new plans was ever going to bring back the feeling that Fox River had produced. Section 6. The map that could only go one way. Before any of the structural problems arrived, before the contract, dispute and the strike and the genre shifts, there was a tattoo. The tattoo is where Prison Break began as an idea. It is also, in a very direct sense, where Prison Break ended as a concept. Not when it was canceled, not when the ratings fell, but at the specific moment in Season 4 when Michael Scofield sat down and had the artwork burned off his body. That moment was filmed and put on screen in the opening of the season. The burns were visible. The tattoo was gone. And what went with it was not just a piece of imagery, but the single device that had made Prison Break different from every other show on television when it first aired. To understand what was lost, it helps to go back to what the tattoo actually was, and what it actually did inside the story. Michael Scofield was a structural engineer. His profession was not a casual detail. The show built its entire first season on the idea that a man who had spent his career studying the architecture of buildings would be the one person capable of looking at a maximum security prison and finding the way out of it that nobody else could see. He had studied Fox River before he ever set foot inside it. He had obtained the original building plans. He had mapped the ventilation systems, the drainage routes, the guard rotation schedules, the specific measurements of specific walls. He understood the building as a structure rather than as a place of confinement. And that understanding was the foundation of everything. The tattoo encoded all of that knowledge onto his body in a form that looked like decorative art. It covered his arms, his chest, his torso. To anyone looking at it casually, it was elaborate personal artwork. The kind of thing a person gets because they want it, carrying no obvious meaning beyond the visual. To Michael, and eventually to the audience, it was a map. Each section of the design corresponded to a specific element of the escape plan. A particular image indicated a specific location within the prison. A pattern of lines described the path through a ventilation shaft. Details that appeared to be purely decorative turned out, when you knew what to look for, to be functional information. Measurements, angles, reference points, all of it hidden inside a design that could be carried openly without arousing suspicion. The reveal of this was one of the most effective pieces of storytelling in the show's first season. The audience discovered what the tattoo contained at roughly the same pace Michael revealed it to the people around him, and used it to solve specific problems as they arose. Each time a new obstacle appeared in the escape plan, a new section of the tattoo became relevant. The locked door, the missing key, the unexpected guard. Each problem had a corresponding solution encoded somewhere on Michael's body. And the process of finding that solution and connecting it to the relevant piece of ink was something the show turned into a weekly ritual that never became repetitive because the specific challenge was always different. This device worked for several reasons that are worth being precise about. The tattoo gave the audience a physical, visible object to track alongside the story. It made Michael's intelligence tangible, not just a quality that characters around him observed and described, but something the audience could see expressed in a real and specific form. It created a sense of preparation and foresight that no other character on the show possessed. And it gave Season 1 a quality of completeness that most serialized television does not achieve. Because the audience understood from relatively early on that the tattoo had been designed to solve exactly the number of problems the season was going to produce. The map led to Fox River's exit. Everything in Season 1 was a step along that map. The criticism began in Season 2, and it came from a professional critic at a major publication, on the record, while the season was airing. Robert Bianco, the television critic for USA Today, reviewed Season 2 and commented on what the tattoo had become in the show's second year. His language was direct. He described what he called harebrained absurdities taking over the show, and identified the tattoo specifically as the source of the problem. He said the writers were being incredibly lazy by continuing to use the tattoo as an all-purpose plot fix. The phrase all-purpose plot fix is worth holding on to, because it names precisely what had happened between Season 1 and Season 2. In Season 1, the tattoo was a complete system. It encoded a specific plan for a specific location, and the show used it to build that plan piece by piece across 22 episodes. Every time the tattoo was referenced, it was in service of the thing it had been designed to do. The device and the story were perfectly matched because they had been designed together, each one built around the other. In Season 2, the characters were no longer inside Fox River. They were scattered across the country, moving between locations, dealing with situations the tattoo had never been designed to address. The escape from Fox River was finished. The map had been followed to its endpoint. But the show continued to reach back to the tattoo as a source of solutions to new problems. Problems that had nothing to do with the building the tattoo had encoded. A piece of the design that had corresponded to a specific route through the prison was now being interpreted as relevant to a completely different situation, in a completely different location. The map was being asked to lead somewhere it had never been drawn to go. Bianco's critique landed during Season 2, which still received a 71% rating on Rotten Tomatoes and was generally considered a solid follow-up to the first season. The tattoo problem he identified was real, but was not yet critical. The show had enough other things working in its favor that the overextension of a single device did not sink it. But his observation pointed at something that would become more damaging the longer the show continued to stretch the tattoo beyond its original purpose. By the end of Season 3, the tattoo's usefulness had been effectively exhausted. The device that had been the show's defining element for its first season and had been used as narrative scaffolding through its second and third had nowhere left to go. And so, at the beginning of Season 4, Michael had it removed. The procedure was referenced on screen. The burns were visible. The tattoo that had launched the show, that had been in promotional materials since before the first episode aired, that had been the single most distinctive visual element of the entire series, was written out of the show's body permanently. The removal was not presented as a small detail. The audience was shown it clearly. Whether the intention was to signal a deliberate fresh start for the season, or simply to address the fact that the device no longer had any story function, is something only the writers can answer with certainty. What the removal communicated, regardless of intention, was that the thing Prison Break had been built on was gone. The show was going to continue without the element that had made it different from every other drama on the network. What remained after the tattoo was removed was a group of talented actors playing characters that audiences had spent 3 seasons caring about, operating inside a story format that had no unique identity of its own. Season 4's Scylla mission was a heist structure. Heist stories have a long and successful history in film and television. The problem was not that heist stories are bad. The problem was that Prison Break had never been a heist show. It had been a very specific kind of escape story, and the specific qualities of that escape story, the enclosed location, the encoded map, the countdown clock, the single plan being executed under constant pressure, were all absent from the format that replaced it. Paul Schuring's reduced involvement during this period is a documented production fact. He had stepped back from running the day-to-day work of the show after Season 2, remaining as an executive producer in title, while the writers' rooms of Seasons 3 and 4 operated largely without his direct guidance. He confirmed in later interviews that he was burned out after 2 seasons. The Grokopedia entry on Schuring, drawing from documented production accounts, notes that his reduced hands-on involvement contributed to the issues in later seasons, as other writers introduced increasingly complicated conspiracy elements that moved further and further from the original premise. This is not a criticism of the writers who worked on those seasons. They were professionals, working on a network drama with specific requirements. A 22-episode order, an audience with established expectations, a set of characters who needed to keep moving through a story even when the original story had concluded. The problem they faced was not one that could be solved by being more skilled or more creative. The problem was structural, and it had been structural since before Season 2 began. Schuring himself had identified it clearly when he told Fox that the show was designed for 2 seasons. The absence of his direct guidance in Seasons 3 and 4 was not the cause of the show's decline. It was a symptom of it. The original architect stepping away from a building he had already described as being built past its foundations. The tattoo, Schuring's involvement, and the contained world of Fox River were 3 elements that had existed together to produce Season 1's particular quality. They were not separate features that happened to coincide. they were interdependent. The tattoo worked because it encoded a plan for the specific building Scheuring had designed the season around. The building worked as a setting because Scheuring had built the whole story around the tension of being confined inside it. The confined world worked as a storytelling framework because the tattoo gave the audience a physical object to follow through it. Remove any one of those three elements, and the other two lose some of their power. Remove all three, which is what happened progressively across seasons 2, 3, and 4, and what remains is a show that shares its name and cast with something that no longer quite exists. The audience that stuck with Prison Break through its later seasons was not watching the same thing the 10.5 million viewers who tuned in for the premiere had watched. They were watching something that had grown out of it, that shared its DNA, that had the same faces in it, but the specific combination of elements that had made those 10.5 million people come back the following week and the week after that was not reassembled in any of the seasons that followed. The critical scores reflect this. The viewership numbers reflect this. The Fox cancellation reflects this. And the revival's 3.96 million viewers reflect this most clearly of all. Because a show that could pull 9.2 million in 2005, drawing fewer than 4 million 12 years later, with the same creator and the same leads, is a show whose audience understood something that the network was still testing the limits of. The tattoo on Michael Scofield's body had been the show's identity. When it was burned away at the start of season 4, what went with it was not just a plot device. The map that could only go one way had reached its end, and no amount of new missions or new prisons or new countries was going to produce a second one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. All of this, the design limits, the contract breakdown, the strike, the genre drift, the revival's failure, the tattoo's exhaustion, adds up to a picture of a show that was genuinely exceptional at the very beginning and genuinely unable to sustain that exceptionalism once the conditions that produced it were gone. But there is one final layer to the story that has not been addressed yet, and it is the one that explains not just why the show fell apart, but why it was always going to fall apart, regardless of how good the writers were or how committed the cast remained. That layer is about the prison itself, about what Fox River actually was, and why no location the show visited after leaving it could ever carry the same weight. Section 7. The prison that could not be replaced. Fox River State Penitentiary was not just a location. It was a world. That distinction sounds simple, but it explains more about what Prison Break lost after season 1 than almost anything else. A location is a place where things happen. A world is a place with its own rules, its own power structures, its own set of relationships that existed before the story arrived and would continue existing after it left. Fox River was a world in that second sense, and the show had spent its entire first season building it so carefully and so completely that by the time the escape happened and the gates closed behind the characters for the last time, the audience had absorbed that world deeply enough to feel its absence in everything that came after. Season 1 was filmed primarily in and around Chicago, Illinois. The production used real locations in the area to create the physical reality of Fox River, and the Chicago setting the show a particular feel. Cold, gray, industrial. A place that communicated confinement even in its exterior shots. The choice of location was not accidental. The show needed Fox River to feel like a place with weight, and the Chicago environment provided that weight in a way that a more visually comfortable setting could not have. Inside that setting, the show built something that took the full 22 episodes to understand completely. Fox River was not simply a building full of prisoners. It was a society with its own economy, its own hierarchy, its own forms of currency and debt and obligation. The guards ran the official structure. The prisoners ran the unofficial one. And between those two structures, the show had placed every character in the story at a specific point that determined what they could do, who they could talk to, what they needed, and what they feared. Warden Henry Pope was at the top of the official structure. He was not a villain. He was a decent man running a prison, trying to do his job correctly. And he had taken a specific liking to Michael because Michael was educated, polite, and skilled. And because Michael had made himself useful to the warden by helping with a personal project Pope had been working on for years. That relationship was one of the most carefully constructed in the show. Michael needed access to the warden's office. Getting that access required building genuine trust with Pope over time. The show let that trust develop slowly across multiple episodes. And by the time Michael was using it to further the escape, the audience had watched the relationship become real enough that the manipulation at its center carried genuine moral weight. Michael was deceiving someone who trusted him. The show did not pretend otherwise. Captain Brad Bellick occupied a different position in the official structure. He was the head guard at Fox River, a man who used his authority for personal benefit, who took bribes, who ran his section of the prison as a private operation in which the rules existed to serve him rather than the institution. Bellick was corrupt in the specific, small-minded way that a person in a position of minor power can be corrupt. Not dramatically evil, just consistently self-interested and willing to use what leverage he had to get what he wanted. He became aware that something was happening with Michael relatively early in the season, and spent the rest of it trying to figure out what it was and how to turn it to his advantage. The unofficial structure was controlled by John Abruzzi. Abruzzi was the leader of the Chicago mob and the most powerful prisoner at Fox River. He ran the Prison Industries crew, the group of inmates assigned to maintenance and repair work throughout the facility. This detail was not decorative. Michael needed to be on that crew, because it was the only way to access the parts of the prison the escape plan required. Getting onto the crew meant dealing with Abruzzi, which meant that Michael, before he could do anything else, had to negotiate with the most dangerous man in the building. The leverage he used, information about the location of a witness who had testimony that could damage Abruzzi's operation on the outside, was the first of many specific, practical exchanges that gave Season 1 its sense of a plan with real moving parts. Charles Westmoreland was another piece of that structure. Westmoreland was an elderly prisoner who had been at Fox River for years and was widely believed among the inmates to be D.B. Cooper, the man who had hijacked a commercial flight in 1971, extorted a ransom of $200,000, parachuted from the plane, and was never found. The show used this as the basis for a buried money subplot that connected several characters to a shared goal beyond the escape itself. Westmoreland's inclusion gave the season a layer of history, a life that had been lived inside Fox River long before Michael arrived, and that had left something behind. Each of these characters, Pope, Bellick, Abruzzi, Westmoreland, and the others who populated Fox River across Season 1, had a specific function in the ecosystem of the prison, and a specific relationship to what Michael was trying to do. None of them were interchangeable. Remove any one of them, and the escape plan loses a structural element. Pope's trust gave Michael access to the warden's office. Bellic's suspicion created constant pressure, forced the plan to adjust. Abruzzi's resources gave Michael the crew placement and eventually the means of transport for after the escape. Westmoreland's money gave several characters a reason to participate that went beyond simply escaping. The world of Fox River had been constructed so that every person in it was doing something that mattered to the central story. This is the thing that the show was never able to rebuild in any of the locations that followed. Season 2 moved the story to the open road. Characters scattered across the country, each pursuing different objectives, with federal agent Alexander Mahone tracking them on behalf of a government that had its own secret reasons for wanting the escapees dead rather than recaptured. Mahone was a strong addition to the show. Critics noted his arrival positively, describing him as a far more compelling adversary for Michael than Bellic had been. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette's Rob Owen was cited in the Season 2 Wikipedia article as finding Mahone to be a far more worthy opponent. That praise was deserved. William Fichtner's performance as Mahone was one of the genuine highlights of the show's second and third seasons. But Mahone, however effective, was chasing characters across an open landscape rather than being embedded in a world with them. The specific pressure of Fox River, the fact that the walls were real, that the guards were always present, that every move had to be calculated against the constant possibility of being observed, was gone. The manhunt that replaced it was tense in its own way, but the tension was looser. Characters could run, they could hide, they could change location. None of those options had existed inside Fox River, and their absence from the structure of Season 2 changed the fundamental feeling of watching the show. Season 3 attempted to recreate the Fox River dynamic by placing Michael inside another prison. The facility was Penitenciaria Federal de Zona, a Panamanian prison with a very different internal reality. Zona had been established as a place where the guards had withdrawn from the interior entirely, leaving the prisoners to run the inside of the facility themselves. Violence was constant. There was no warden with whom Michael could build a relationship based on trust and mutual usefulness. There was no crew assignment that gave him access to restricted areas. The carefully constructed society of Fox River, with its layered official and unofficial power structures and its specific cast of characters occupying specific roles, had no equivalent inside Zona. The show tried to build something comparable. New characters were introduced inside Zona who could serve some of the structural functions that Fox River's cast had served. But the season had 13 episodes rather than 22, thanks to the strike, and building an entirely new world with its own fully developed set of relationships is not something that 13 episodes can accomplish when the season also has to carry forward the story from the previous 2 years. Zona was a sketch of a prison world where Fox River had been a fully realized one, and the difference was felt. Season 3's Rotten Tomatoes consensus described it as retreading old ground with new contrivances. That reading is accurate. The contrivances the critics identified were the mechanisms the show used to try to reproduce the Fox River experience. The locked world, the impossible plan, the pressure of confinement, in a setting that had not been built to support them. The result was a season that had the shape of what Prison Break was supposed to be, without the substance that had made the shape meaningful. By the time Season 4 abandoned the prison setting entirely and moved the story to Los Angeles, the show had made 3 attempts in as many seasons to find a replacement for Fox River. The Open Road of Season 2, the Panamanian prison of Season 3, and the Covert Mission of Season 4 were 3 different answers to the same question, and none of them fully worked, because the question itself was unanswerable. Fox River had not been a great setting because of something generic about it. It had been a great setting because of the specific combination of elements that Season 1 had spent 22 episodes developing. The characters, the relationships, the power structures, the physical spaces, the particular atmosphere of that particular building in that particular city. That combination had taken a full season to build. It could not be rebuilt somewhere else in a few episodes, or a few seasons, or at all. The world of Fox River was a one-time construction, and the show had spent it in Season 1 with the intention of moving beyond it. Moving beyond it turned out to be the thing that gradually emptied the show of the quality that had made it matter. The Season 1 premiere had drawn 10.5 million viewers. Fox had extended the season mid-run because the numbers were so strong. The show had won the People's Choice Award for Favorite New TV Drama in January 2006. Wentworth Miller had received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actor in a Drama Series at the 63rd Golden Globe Awards in 2006. The theme music, composed by Ramin Djawadi, had been nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award. By every available measure, the show in its first season was not just successful, it was exceptional. The awards attention, the audience size, the critical enthusiasm, all pointed in the same direction. All of that came from a single season, set inside a single prison in Chicago. Everything that followed was the show trying to find a way to sustain what that single season had produced. And the fact that it never fully did is not a mystery. The world that produced those results had been left behind in the Season 1 finale. The show kept going. The world of Fox River did not. The ratings, the critical scores, and the eventual cancellations across the show's run form a line that points consistently in one direction. But behind those numbers is a simpler truth that no chart captures as clearly as the show itself does when you go back and watch the transition from Season 1 to everything that followed. The first season has a particular quality, a sense of precision and pressure and completeness that the later seasons reach for and do not find. Audiences feel this even when they cannot name it. Critics name it in their consensus language without always fully explaining it. And the creator of the show had named it himself before any of it aired, when he told Fox that he had designed the story to end in 2 seasons, and was not sure what came after that. What came after that was 4 more years of television, and a revival 9 years later. All of it in search of something that had existed fully and completely for 22 episodes in a prison in Chicago, and had never quite been found again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The last thing left to examine is not what the show lost, but what the show got right, and specifically, what Season 1 understood about its own premise that the later seasons did not carry forward. Because buried inside the story of how Prison Break fell apart is a clearer picture of what it would have taken for the show to survive. And that picture tells a story about television itself that goes beyond any single series. Section 8. What Season 1 knew. There is a version of the Prison Break story where none of the later problems happen. In that version, Fox takes Schuring's original pitch seriously. The closed-ended miniseries, the self-contained story, the 2 seasons and done. And the show runs exactly as designed. The escape happens at the end of Season 1. The manhunt fills Season 2. The story ends. The characters reach wherever they are going, or they don't. And the screen goes dark on a show that finished on its own terms, with the full weight of everything it had built behind it. That version of Prison Break exists only as a hypothetical. But thinking about it clearly is the best way to understand what Season 1 actually knew about itself, that the network's commercial decisions prevented from being honored. Season 1 knew that its power came from limits. This sounds counterintuitive. Most thinking about storytelling emphasizes freedom. The more places a story can go, the more options the writers have, the richer the experience for the audience. Prison Break Season 1 operated on the opposite principle. It had fewer options than almost any drama on network television at the time. And those restrictions were the source of everything that made it work. The walls of Fox River were not just a physical fact in the story. They were a creative condition that the show had placed on itself. And every single quality that made Season 1 exceptional grew out of what those walls forced the story to do. The confined setting meant that every character mattered in a specific way. There was no room for passengers. Every person inside Fox River who appeared more than once had a defined relationship to the escape, either helping it, threatening it, or existing as a problem that Michael had to manage while keeping the plan moving. Warden Pope's trust gave Michael access. Bellic's suspicion created constant pressure. Abruzzi's power gave Michael the crew placement the plan required. Teabag's threat created a problem Michael had to absorb into the plan rather than solve directly, because solving it directly was impossible without alerting the people he needed to stay unaware. Every character was a piece of a machine, and the machine had a specific job to do. The confined setting also meant that time moved differently inside the show than it did in almost any other drama of that era. The execution date for Lincoln was always present. Every episode took place inside that countdown. The audience never forgot that the clock was running because the show never let them. Small obstacles, a missing screw, a guard arriving earlier than expected, a prisoner noticing something he should not have, carried enormous weight because the margin for error was measured in days and then hours. The confined world and the running clock worked together to create a pressure that was almost physical. Watching Season 1, the feeling of that pressure is real and constant in a way that is very difficult to manufacture without the specific structural conditions the show had built for itself. The premiere drew 10.5 million viewers. The show averaged 9.2 million across its first season. Fox extended the episode order mid-season, making Prison Break the first new series of the 2005 to 2006 television season to receive a full 22-episode order. The show won the People's Choice Award for Favorite New TV Drama in January 2006. Wentworth Miller received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actor in a Drama Series at the 63rd Golden Globe Awards. The theme music, composed by Ramin Djawadi, was nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award. These are not small achievements for a show in its first season. They represent an audience and a critical community recognizing something genuinely exceptional was happening on Monday nights on Fox. All of that came from a story that knew what it was and stayed precisely inside the boundaries of what it was for 22 episodes. Season 1 did not try to be multiple things. It did not expand its world mid-season or introduce new locations or shift its genre to keep things feeling fresh. It stayed inside Fox River, inside the plan, inside the countdown. And it trusted that the specific and intense focus of that one contained story was enough to hold 10 million people's attention for an entire season. The trust was correct. The thing Season 1 understood most clearly was this: the audience was not there for the show in general. They were there for this specific story, in this specific place, told in this specific way. The feeling of watching Prison Break in its first season is the feeling of watching something that has been very deliberately constructed. A plan inside a story about a plan. The audience knew that every episode was a step along a route that had been mapped before filming began. They could feel the design underneath the drama. That feeling of encountering something genuinely thought through, something built with real care and specific intention, is one of the most reliable things that keeps audiences coming back to a serialized story week after week. Season 2 had some of this, but less of it. The Rotten Tomatoes score dropped from 79% to 71%. The 18 to 49 demographic, which had ranked the show first in the country on its premiere night, fell by 20% even at the Season 2 premiere, before the season had done anything to alienate its audience, simply by virtue of no longer being Season 1. The audience sensed, almost immediately, that something had changed. The contained world was gone. The single plan was gone. The clock was gone. What remained was a group of characters the audience had invested in, a pursuit story built around them, and a set of new complications the show was generating as it went, rather than moving toward an ending it had always known was coming. The audience reduction between Season 2 and the later seasons was not sudden. Nobody woke up one day and decided to stop watching Prison Break. It was a slow process of the show becoming slightly less like itself with each passing season, and each slight reduction in audience being followed by another one. The 9.2 million average of Season 1 became the Season 2 premiere of 9.4 million, a brief uptick, followed by the progressive slide that ended at 6.1 million for Season 4 and 3.96 million for the revival. The line only goes one way. From 10.5 million at the very beginning to under 4 million at the end. And the shape of that line corresponds almost exactly to how far the show had moved, by any given season, from the specific conditions of Season 1. The critical scores follow the same shape. Season 1 at 79% on Rotten Tomatoes. Season 2 at 71%. Season 3 at 50%. Season 4 at 50%. The revival at 56%. The IMDb user scores, which represent a different kind of measurement, not professional critics, but the accumulated ratings of the people who watched, tell the same story. Season 1 at 8.8, Season 2 at 8.5, Season 3 at 8.2, Season 4 at a significantly lower 7.4. These are not dramatic collapses. They are steady, consistent, season-by-season reductions that describe a show moving gradually away from something that worked toward something that worked less well, in measurable increments across its entire run. What Season 1 knew that the later seasons could not fully apply is something that goes beyond Prison Break and touches on how certain kinds of stories work. Some stories are built with a fixed amount of fuel. The fuel is the premise, the specific, irreplaceable situation that generates the tension and meaning of the whole thing. A story with a fixed amount of premise fuel can burn brilliantly for exactly as long as the fuel lasts. And the best version of that story is the one that knows precisely when the fuel runs out and ends there. Extending the story past that point does not produce more of the same experience. It produces a different experience that borrows the name and the characters of the original without having access to what actually powered it. Scheuring understood this from the beginning. He designed the show around 2 seasons precisely because he could see that the premise had enough fuel to power 2 seasons and not more. His discomfort with writing stories without a defined endpoint, something he mentioned in multiple interviews across many years, came from an understanding of this principle at a very practical level. He needed to know where the story ended before he could write it, because the ending was not just the conclusion of the story. The ending was the thing the whole story was moving toward. And without knowing what it was, the design of everything before it would be wrong. Fox's commercial decision to extend the show past 2 seasons was not made out of bad faith. It was made because the ratings were exceptional, and the audience was large, and the business case for continuing was overwhelming. From a pure numbers perspective, Prison Break in its first season was one of the most successful new dramas on network television. Of course, a network was going to continue it. The decision to extend was the only decision the commercial logic of broadcast television pointed toward. The problem was that commercial logic and creative logic were pointing in different directions. And in the relationship between a network and a series, commercial logic is the one with more leverage. The result was a show that produced 2 strong seasons, a shortened 3rd season that did better than it had any right to under its circumstances, a 4th season that had almost nothing in common with the first except the names and faces of its characters, and a revival a decade later that confirmed what the cancellation of the original run had already suggested. The specific version of Prison Break that had drawn those 10 million viewers existed for 1 season. Every season after that was something else. Something with the same name, often with real quality in it, but always reaching back toward a feeling it could not quite find because the conditions that had produced the feeling were gone. The Golden Globe nomination that Wentworth Miller received in 2006 was for his work in Season 1. The People's Choice Award the show won in January 2006 was for its first season. The Emmy nomination for the theme music came from the show's initial burst of quality and attention. All of the recognition that arrived in the show's first full year of eligibility pointed at the same season. The industry, like the audience, was responding to what Season 1 was. And what Season 1 was could not be separated from where it was set, what its central device was, how long it had been designed to last, and who was running it, with complete creative investment in seeing the original vision through to exactly the conclusion it had always been heading toward. The full picture of Prison Break is the picture of a show that understood itself perfectly for 1 season and spent 4 more years and a revival trying to hold on to that understanding as the conditions that had made it possible fell away one by one. The design, the tattoo, the prison, the creator's daily involvement, each one gone by the time the show ended, and each one, as it left, taking some of the original quality with it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final question that sits underneath all of this is not why Prison Break fell apart after Season 1. That question has been answered across every section that came before this one. The final question is what the show's complete story, the rise, the slow decline, the cancellation, the revival, the second cancellation, tells us about television itself and about the particular kind of story that Prison Break was trying to be. Because Prison Break was not just a case study in poor planning or network interference. It was something rarer and more specific than that. And what it was, seen clearly from the distance of 20 years, is a better show than its later seasons allowed it to be, and a more important one than its ultimate fate as a network drama that ran too long might suggest. Section 9. What the world did with it. The most watched television series on Netflix for the first week of August 2024 was not a new show. It was not a prestige drama produced by a streaming platform with a $100 million budget. It was not a limited series designed specifically for the binge-watching habits of the current era. The most watched television series on Netflix for that week was Prison Break, a network drama that had premiered 19 years earlier, that had been canceled in 2009, that had returned briefly in 2017 and been canceled again, and that had not produced a new episode in 7 years. The numbers from that week were not small. Prison Break generated 1.6 billion minutes of viewing time between August 5th and August 11th, 2024. The following week, it held the top position again, with 1.61 billion minutes. The week of August 26th through September 1st produced 1.188 billion minutes. In the week leading up to September 15th, 2024, all 3 original seasons reappeared on Netflix's English-language TV chart simultaneously. Season 1 ranked 3rd, with 4.7 million views. Season 2 ranked 7th, with 2.8 million. The show held the #1 streaming position for 4 consecutive weeks. Nielsen Media Research tracked and confirmed these figures. These numbers require a moment of genuine attention, because they are describing something unusual about how Prison Break lives in the world nearly 2 decades after it first aired. A show that averaged 6.1 million viewers in its final original season and drew fewer than 4 million for its revival, was generating over 1 billion minutes of viewing time per week on a streaming platform in 2024. The audience that had drifted away during the original run had not disappeared. They had moved to a different format, and when the show became available in that format, they came back. New audiences who had never watched it during its original broadcast discovered it and responded to it strongly enough to push it to the top of the global streaming charts for a month. The Hispanic viewing community was identified by Nielsen as a particularly significant portion of that streaming audience, constituting nearly 1/3 of the viewers during that period. This detail points to something the original broadcast ratings had not fully captured. The show's reach across different communities and language groups had always been broader than the domestic Fox numbers suggested. The global picture of Prison Break's reach during its original run was already substantial. In France, the show premiered on August 31st, 2006, and averaged 5.5 million viewers. The French Season 2 premiere on September 13th, 2007, drew 5.3 million. The French broadcaster M6 and the Belgian network RTL-TVI both replaced the show's original theme music in their title sequences with a song by French rapper Faf Larage called Pas le temps, a localization decision that generated significant publicity and helped embed the show into those markets in a way that felt culturally specific rather than simply imported. In the United Kingdom, the first 2 seasons aired on Channel 5 before Sky One acquired the rights for Season 3, paying £500,000 per episode for the broadcast rights. That figure, £500,000 per episode, represented a significant investment for a British broadcaster and indicated how seriously the international market was taking the show during its peak years. In Hong Kong, Prison Break's broadcast on TVB Pearl produced the largest audience the channel had recorded for any foreign drama. The series premiere averaged 260,000 viewers. The Season 1 finale averaged 470,000, an 80% increase from where it had started, which is the opposite trajectory from what the American ratings showed over the full run. A show that was losing audience in its home market was building audience in Hong Kong across the same season. The Russian television industry took the show seriously enough to produce a full adaptation. The Russian version was called Pobeg, the Russian word for escape. and it premiered on September 20th, 2010, on Channel One, one of the country's primary broadcast networks. The adaptation used many elements of the original series directly, including specific scenes and lines of dialogue, while also introducing new storylines and characters designed to connect the story to the Russian cultural context. The existence of a full domestic adaptation, rather than simply airing the American original with subtitles or dubbing, indicated that the premise was considered strong enough to rebuild from the ground up for a different audience. In Japan, the show's reach extended into a completely different medium. An official manga adaptation of Prison Break became available on the online service Piccoma beginning June 23, 2019, 10 years after the original American run had ended. The artwork was done by Hikosuke Soyama, and the adaptation was produced under the supervision of 20th Century Fox. A manga adaptation of an American network drama a decade after its cancellation is not a common occurrence. It indicates a level of ongoing cultural relevance in the Japanese market that most American television shows never achieve, and that Prison Break had maintained through the years between its cancellation and the adaptation's publication. The show extended into physical experiences as well. Prison Break Live was an interactive attraction created by the Sudden Impact Entertainment Company that toured from 2006 to 2008. The attraction visited the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom, China, Germany, and Mexico. An interactive experience based on a television show touring 6 countries across 3 continents while the show was still in its original run, represents a level of commercial and cultural traction that went significantly beyond a successful American drama. The show had become an event in international markets in a way that its domestic ratings, while strong in Season 1, do not fully capture. An official magazine was launched by Titan Publishing on November 21, 2006. A tie-in novel written by Paul Ruditis and published by Simon & Schuster arrived on May 8, 2007. A companion book covering the show's full production history, titled Prison Break: Behind the Scenes, was published in September 2009 by Insight Editions, featuring commentary from writers Christian Trocchi and Kalinda Vasquez, alongside creator Paul Scheuring and executive producer Matt Olmstead. A video game called Prison Break: The Conspiracy was released on March 30, 2010, following a canceled earlier development. The game's protagonist was a company agent sent inside Fox River to observe Michael Scofield, and it featured voice performances from the original cast. The awards recognition that came during Season 1 demonstrated how quickly the industry identified the show as something worth paying attention to. The 63rd Golden Globe Awards in 2006 produced 2 nominations for Prison Break: Best Drama Television Series and Best Actor in a Drama for Wentworth Miller. These are the top categories. The show had been on the air for less than a full season when the nominations were announced. Miller also received a nomination, the 2005 Saturn Awards for Best Actor on Television. Ramin Djawadi's theme music received a Primetime Emmy nomination. The People's Choice Award for Favorite New TV Drama was won outright in January 2006, with the show beating Commander-in-Chief and Criminal Minds. These achievements all point in the same direction, toward a show that, in its first season, had the full attention of both its audience and the industry, and that built a global cultural footprint substantial enough to sustain interest across 2 decades multiple platform transitions, and a revival that underperformed commercially. The gap between Prison Break's cultural legacy and its quality arc across its full run is the most revealing thing about what the show ultimately was. By the numbers, it was a series that peaked in its first season, declined steadily across 3 more, briefly returned 9 years later to ratings that were less than half its worst original season, and was canceled twice. That is a specific kind of story about a television show. A story about a great beginning that a commercial structure would not allow to end correctly. But the streaming numbers from 2024 tell a different story about how the show lives in the world. 1.5 billion minutes of viewing in a single week, 19 years after the premiere. 4 consecutive weeks at the top of the global streaming chart. New audiences discovering the show and driving it back to #1 without any promotional push, without a new season being announced, without any event to explain the sudden surge. People were simply finding Prison Break and watching it because they had heard about it, or had started it, and could not stop. The thing they were finding, in overwhelming proportion, was Season 1. The streaming chart that week in September 2024 showed Season 1 at #3 and Season 2 at #7. Season 3 and Season 4 did not appear on the chart separately. The audience that was driving those billion-minute weeks was concentrated in the seasons that the critical scores and the original ratings had both identified as the show's strongest. The streaming audience was doing instinctively what the critics had described analytically. They were going back to the version of Prison Break that worked completely. This is the clearest possible evidence of what Prison Break actually was. Not a 4-season drama with an uneven arc. Not a franchise that ran too long and should have ended sooner. The show's second life on streaming reveals it as a first season. An exceptional, tightly built, brilliantly designed first season that happened to be followed by additional content that carried the same name. New audiences watching Prison Break in 2024 were experiencing Season 1 and responding to it the same way 10 million Americans had responded to it in 2005. The conditions that made it work were still working, because those conditions had been built into the structure of the season and had not changed in 19 years. The global reach, the adaptations, the awards, the streaming numbers. All of it is a measurement of a show that had 1 season of complete creative alignment between its premise, its design, its execution, and the creative intentions of the person who built it. That 1 season was enough to produce a cultural footprint that has outlasted the show itself by nearly 2 decades. And that footprint makes the story of what happened after Season 1 both sadder and more interesting than it would be if the show had simply failed. Prison Break did not fail. Its first season was a genuine achievement that the industry and the audience both recognized as exceptional when it aired and have continued recognizing across the years since. What happened after Season 1 is the story of that achievement being extended past the point where the conditions that produced it could be maintained. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The full accounting of what Prison Break was, and what it could have been, and what the distance between those two things cost the show, is what the conclusion of this story has to carry. Because when everything is laid out together, all of it, from the first decision to extend the show past Scheuring's 2-season design to the last streaming numbers from 2024, what emerges is not just the story of a television show that fell apart. What emerges is a precise picture how great things break, and why the breaking is almost never a single moment, but a series of small decisions made in the space between what a story needs and what a business requires. Section 10. How Great Things Break. Everything that happened to Prison Break after Season 1 was a consequence of one decision made before Season 2 began. Not the writer's strike, not the contract dispute, not the genre shifts, not the tattoo removal, not the Scylla mission, not the revival. All of those things were consequences. The decision was simpler, and it was made by a network that looked at 10.5 million viewers on a Monday night in August 2005 and concluded that a story designed to end in 2 seasons was going to continue indefinitely. Understanding why that decision broke the show requires holding the full picture in view at once, rather than examining each piece in isolation. Every section of this story has covered a specific thing that went wrong. The 2-season design that Fox extended past its natural limits. The tattoo that was built for one prison and one prison only. The contract dispute that removed the show's most emotionally important relationship for an entire season, and then reversed the death it had used to cover that removal. The strike that cut the 3rd season from 22 episodes to 13, and forced a mid-season climax to become a finale. The genre drift that turned a precision escape story into a spy procedural operating out of a rented house in Los Angeles. The creator stepping back from the production he had designed. The revival that drew 3.96 million viewers in 2017 from a show that had drawn 9.2 million on average 12 years earlier. Each of those things is real and documented and specific. But they are not separate problems that happen to arrive at the same time. They are the stages of a single process. The process by which a story built for a specific amount of runway gets extended past that runway. And the consequences of that extension compound across every season that follows. The clearest way to see this is to lay the numbers against each other in sequence. Season 1 premiered on August 29, 2005, to 10.5 million viewers. It averaged 9.2 million across its run. The critical approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes was 79%. The IMDb user rating was 8.8 out of 10. The show won the People's Choice Award for Favorite New TV Drama in January 2006. Wentworth Miller received a Golden Globe nomination for Best Actor in a Drama at the 63rd Golden Globe Awards. The show itself was nominated for Best Drama Series at the same ceremony. The theme music, composed by Ramin Djawadi, received a Primetime Emmy nomination. Fox extended the episode order mid-season, making Prison Break the first new series of the 2005 to 2006 television season to receive a full 22-episode order. The show ranked first in both the 18 to 49 and 18 to 34 demographics on its premiere night. These are the measurements of a show in complete alignment: premise, execution, audience response, and critical recognition, all pointing in the same direction at the same time. Season 2 opened with 9.4 million viewers, but the 18 to 49 demographic had already dropped 20% from the series premiere. The Rotten Tomatoes score fell to 71%. The show was still strong. The manhunt structure worked. Alexander Mahone worked as an antagonist. The season held its audience well enough that the decline felt gradual rather than alarming. But the critic at USA Today had already identified the tattoo problem in real time. The all-purpose plot fix language that named something real about what was happening to the show's central device when the story asked it to do things it had not been designed to do. Season 3 aired with 13 episodes instead of 22, because the Writers Guild of America had been on strike for 100 days, and the production could not continue without its writing staff. The escape from Sona, which had been positioned as the mid-season climax of a longer story, became the season finale of a shorter one. Sarah Wayne Callies was absent because a contract negotiation had collapsed after the production team reduced their offer from 13 episodes to 11 to 10 to 9 to 4 to a phone conversation that was also declined. The character was killed off-screen with a box. The Rotten Tomatoes score fell to 50%. The IMDb user rating dropped to 8.2. Season 4 moved the story to Los Angeles, removed the tattoo from Michael's body, the opening scenes, converted the ensemble into a covert spy team, and built its central narrative around retrieving 6 pieces of a data device from 6 different people across 22 episodes. Sarah Tancredi came back because the death that had served as her exit had been left ambiguous enough to reverse. The primary villain changed 3 times across the season. The average viewership fell to 6.1 million, a drop of more than 3 million from the Season 1 average. The Rotten Tomatoes score held at 50%, with a consensus describing the season's twists as ludicrous and plot-breaking, and stating plainly that the story should have ended sooner. The IMDb user score fell to 7.4. On January 13, 2009, Fox president Kevin Reilly confirmed at the TV Critics Press Tour that the season would be the show's last. He said the stories had been told. The show ended with a direct-to-DVD film called Prison Break: The Final Break, released on July 21, 2009, which concluded storylines that the television finale had left unresolved. The revival aired in 2017. 9 episodes. Paul Scheuring returned as showrunner. Wentworth Miller returned as Michael Schofield, explaining the character's survival of his Season 4 death through a mystery that was central to the season's story. The setting was Yemen. The average viewership was 3.96 million. The Rotten Tomatoes score was 56%. The Metacritic score was 48 out of 100. Fox confirmed in January 2018 that a 6th season was in early development. Fox confirmed in August 2019 that there were no current plans for more Prison Break. Wentworth Miller stated in late 2020 that he would not be returning to play straight characters, following his public coming out in 2013. The show was finished. That sequence of numbers, from 10.5 million to 3.96 million, from 79% to 56%, from 8.8 to a Season 4 low of 7.4, is not the story of a show that made a series of avoidable mistakes. The mistakes that were made were real. The Sarah situation was avoidable with a different negotiation outcome. The strike was external and nobody's fault. The genre drift of Season 4 was a creative response to a structural problem that had no clean solution. But the deeper issue beneath all of them was not avoidable, because it was baked into the show's identity before the first episode aired. Paul Scheuring designed Prison Break as a closed story. He was explicit about this in interviews across multiple years and multiple publications. He told Fox before the show began that he had a 2-year plan and that the story would be done at the end of it. He said he was only comfortable writing stories with a defined endpoint built in from the start, because the ending was not just the conclusion. The ending was the thing the whole structure was pointing toward. And without knowing what it was, nothing before it could be designed correctly. He was right about this. Season 1 proves he was right. The feeling of Season 1, the pressure, the precision, the sense of a plan being executed with complete intention, comes directly from the fact that every element of the season had been designed in relation to a specific ending that was already known before filming began. Fox's decision to extend the show was made out of commercial logic that was equally correct from a business perspective. 9.2 million viewers per week is a significant number for any network drama. The show had won awards. It had critical attention. It had a passionate audience and international reach. The case for continuing it was overwhelming from the perspective of a broadcast network trying to hold its Monday night audience. Both things were true simultaneously. Schering was right that the story was designed for 2 seasons. Fox was right that the numbers justified continuation. Those two correct things were in direct conflict with each other. And the conflict could only be resolved one way in the relationship between a creator and a network. The network's preference prevailed. The result was a show that spent 3 seasons and a revival trying to regenerate something it had used completely in 2. The confined world of Fox River. The tattoo that encoded a specific plan for a specific building. The execution countdown that gave every scene its weight. The ensemble of characters whose function within the story had been precisely calibrated to the requirements of the escape. The direct creative involvement of the person who had designed all of those elements and understood how they connected. One by one, across 4 years, and then again across a revival season. Each of these elements was either exhausted or removed, or replaced with something that carried the same name, but not the same function. The tattoo had been criticized as early as Season 2 for being stretched past its purpose. By Season 4, it was burned off Michael's body on screen. The Fox River world had been left behind in the Season 1 finale. Season 3's Sona was a 13-episode sketch of what Fox River had been, built under strike conditions without the episode count needed to develop it properly. Season 4's Los Angeles abandoned the prison format entirely. Schering's daily involvement ended after Season 2, with his own words describing him as burned out by that point. The Sarah Tancredi relationship, the human center of the show's emotional story, was removed for all of Season 3 and had to be walked back into the narrative via an explanation that retroactively made the previous season's most dramatic moment into something that had not been what it appeared. Each of these losses was a step in the same direction, away from the specific version of Prison Break that had generated those measurements: the premiere audience, the Golden Globe nominations, the People's Choice Award, the Emmy nomination for the theme music, the international expansion, the Sky One deal at £500,000 per episode. All of that had come from one season. And the reason it had come from one season is not because the writers got lucky or the stars aligned in an unrepeatable way. It is because the first season had been designed as a complete thing, with an ending built into its structure, and every element calibrated to reach that ending as effectively as possible. The streaming numbers from 2024 confirm this with a clarity that the original ratings only implied. When Prison Break returned to cultural relevance on Netflix in August 2024, generating 1.6 billion minutes of viewing in a single week, and holding the top streaming position for 4 consecutive weeks, the audience was not distributed evenly across the show's 5 seasons. The September 2024 Netflix chart showed Season 1 at number 3 and Season 2 at number 7. Seasons 3, 4, and 5 did not appear on the chart separately. The audience driving those billion-minute weeks was going to the seasons that the critical scores and the original viewership numbers had always identified as the strongest. 19 years after the premiere, new audiences finding Prison Break were responding to the same thing that 10 million people had responded to in 2005. The first 2 seasons, and especially the first, held up because they had been built to hold. The later seasons were harder to find on the chart because the qualities that drive that kind of sustained audience response had progressively left the show as its conditions changed. This is what makes Prison Break's story worth understanding beyond the immediate facts of ratings and cancellations. The show is a clear and precisely documented example of something that happens regularly in television and is rarely examined this carefully, because most shows do not produce the kind of paper trail that Prison Break left behind. Scheuring's interviews across 2006, 2017, multiple outlets, multiple years, are unusually direct about the creative intentions behind the show and about where those intentions stopped being honored. Olmstead's TV Guide interviews in 2007 and 2008 about the Sarah situation are unusually transparent about the business decisions that shaped the narrative in real time. Kevin Riley's public statements at the 2009 TV Critics Press Tour are unusually candid about the commercial realities that drove both the extension and the cancellation. The full record of what happened to Prison Break is available in a way that makes the general principle visible in specific detail. The general principle is this: a story designed to end at a specific point carries that endpoint inside itself as an active force. The knowledge of where the story is going shapes every scene that builds toward it. The audience feels the shape of the ending approaching, even when they do not know its exact content. This is what creates the particular tension of a well-designed serialized story. The sense that everything matters because everything is moving towards something real and specific and inevitable. When that endpoint is removed by a decision to continue past it, the force it was generating does not transfer to the new story. It dissipates. What remains is a show with the same characters and a story without the same internal pressure. And audiences feel that difference, even when they cannot name it. The ratings reflect it. The critical scores reflect it. The slow reduction in viewership from season to season is its most measurable expression. Prison Break entered 2005 as a miniseries screenplay that Fox had rejected as too unconventional. Greenlit only after the success of Lost demonstrated that audiences would follow a complex serialized story across multiple seasons. It became the most successful new drama of its season, drew global audiences across more than a dozen countries, generated adaptations in Russia and Japan, toured an interactive live experience across 6 continents, and produced a set of numbers in its first season that the rest of its run spent 4 years and a decade later revival unable to match. The show's peak and its decline are not separate stories. They are the same story. The story of what happens when something that knows exactly what it is gets asked to become something it was not designed to be, and does its best to comply. and loses something permanent in the effort. The final accounting of Prison Break is not a story about failure. The show produced some of the most effective network television of the mid-2000s. Its first season remains, by every available measurement across nearly 20 years of audience response, a genuinely exceptional piece of storytelling. Its later seasons, even in their diminished state, produced individual moments and character work that the people who stayed with the show through its full run remember with real affection. The Sarah and Michael reunion in Season 4 mattered to the people who had watched the relationship develop from Season 1. Mahone's grief arc was noted by critics as one of the strongest pieces of character work the show produced across its entire run. The revival gave T-Bag a storyline that was different from anything the character had been given before, and used it to produce something genuinely affecting before taking it away. None of that changes the shape of the arc. The shape of the arc is what it is, and all the measurements point the same direction. But holding the full picture, the brilliance of Season 1, the structural problems that followed it, the global reach the show achieved, the streaming numbers that proved its first season's durability 19 years later, and the specific, documented decisions that produced every stage of the decline, produces something more useful than a simple verdict on whether the show succeeded or failed. What it produces is a precise account of how great things break. Not all at once, not through a single catastrophic decision or a dramatic collapse, through a series of small, reasonable choices, each one made with legitimate justification in the moment it was made. Each one moving the story slightly further from the conditions that had made it extraordinary, until the distance between what the show was and what it had been was too large to close, and the audience that had come for the original thing had mostly found somewhere else to be. There is one remaining question that the full record raises but has not yet answered directly. And it is the question that makes everything else in this story land differently when it is addressed. Given everything that is now known about why Prison Break fell apart after Season 1, given Scheuring's documented 2-season design and Fox's documented commercial decision to extend it, and the precise chain of consequences that followed, was there any version of events in which the show could have sustained its first season's quality across multiple years? Or was the decline not just predictable, but inevitable from the moment the network saw those premiere numbers and decided the story was going to keep going? The answer is no. There was no version of events in which Prison Break sustained what Season 1 produced. Because what Season 1 produced was not a television show in the ordinary sense. It was a single, complete, self-contained plan filmed across 22 episodes. And plans do not repeat. The tattoo could only map one prison. The execution clock could only run once. The world of Fox River could only be built once. And once left behind, could never be rebuilt somewhere else with the same materials. Scheuring knew this before the first episode aired. He said it plainly to the network, in rooms where the decision was being made, in interviews across more than a decade, in the condition he placed on the revival, that it be 9 episodes and nothing more. Prison Break was always going to fall apart after Season 1, because falling apart after Season 1 was written into its design from the beginning. And the only real question was whether the people with the power to let it end would choose to honor what it was over what it could continue to earn. They made the choice they made. The show ran the distance that choice required. And what remains, when everything else has settled, is a first season that still pulls over 1 billion minutes of viewing in a single week, 19 years after it aired. Proof that the thing Scheuring built in that one specific season was strong enough to outlast everything the industry did to it afterward. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.